Hi everyone, welcome. Do introduce yourself in the chat and say hello to everyone else. And welcome to the National Volunteering Forum. My name is Rebecca Young. I'm the Head of Policy at NCVO, and we represent charities in England and champion volunteering. Today's forum focuses on volunteering and deprivation, exploring the findings from our time well spent research, which is all about the volunteer experience. By the end of today, you'll have learned about our time well spent research in relation to deprivation. You'll have heard our expert panel's reflections on deprivation and volunteering and had the opportunity to share your own reflections as well. This is our agenda for today. So we'll start off with my colleagues Henry and Catherine talking through the research findings and the implications. We'll then go to Sean Mollard for kind of guest reflections on the findings. And then we'll move on to a panel discussion and Q&A. We'll then go to a break just before 11. And then you'll all have the chance to discuss the findings in groups and share your reflections. Catherine will then lead a session thinking a little bit about kind of our next steps and how we take things forward. So just a few housekeeping slides to run through before we get started. So closed captions have been enabled. You can turn them on or off by clicking on the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. We will also share these slides in the chat for anyone who wants to take a look. And do make yourself comfortable with a tea or a coffee, although we will have a break partway through. If you do have any questions, please post them using the Q&A function in the toolbar, and also put comments in the chat. Your microphone is muted automatically and your video is off. We're not expecting any fire alarms, but obviously do listen out for wherever you are. And we are recording today's session, and by being here, you acknowledge that. We're in presenter mode, so no one is visible. I'll now pass over to Henry to present the findings.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm Henry Allingham. I'm a Senior Research and Insights Officer at NCVO, working across our research programmes. So it's great to be here to talk you through the findings from this element of our time well spent research. I'll hand over to Catherine a little later on to talk you through some of the kind of policy and practical implications of the findings that I'm about to take you through. Before I do talk about the data itself, I'll give a little bit of background to this strand of the time well spent research. As kind of Rebecca nodded to, NCVO's time well spent research programme focuses on the volunteer experience. So looking at how volunteers experience volunteering, its impacts, retention, alongside barriers and enablers to volunteering. So the government's Community Life Survey data on volunteering participation provides important background to the time well spent data. Since the 2016-17 publication, when a breakdown by area of deprivation was first included, people from more deprived areas have consistently been less likely to volunteer, as this graph shows. And this has remained true even while we've seen a general trend of decline across all areas of deprivation. So how does the time well spent data sit within this? Well, this research aims to understand the role of deprivation in volunteering, focusing on volunteer experiences and barriers to participation. Crucially, we want to draw out insights that can inform practitioners and policymakers to take action to improve the experience of volunteers from deprived areas and remove some of those barriers to volunteering. And it's also worth noting up front that while we obviously recognise all the different ways people volunteer, our focus today is on volunteering through groups, clubs and organisations, so formal volunteering. Our time well spent data fills a gap around the volunteer experience, but other research offers some useful insights into volunteering and deprivation. So it tells us there are clear barriers to volunteering for people from deprived areas, including accessing reimbursement, weaker community structures, and a lack of digital access. All of these factors are likely driving some of the lower participation in volunteering in deprived areas that we saw from the Community Life Survey data, which offers some helpful context to the findings from the time well spent data. But beyond just access to volunteering, deprivation affects a huge range of health outcomes And perhaps most directly relevant to this research is the inequality in social capital, as we see deprived areas are often subject to a lack of charities and community groups. So I won't go into too much detail of the method. We'll be publishing a report in due course, which will have a bit more detail on the methodology, should you want it. But the research findings, as I mentioned, are drawn from our time well spent survey. And you took that survey data and mapped the postcodes of respondents who chose to provide them against the Office for National Statistics Index of Multiple Deprivation, which produced a sample of 5,777 records that we used for analysis. This analysis sample was then weighted to be representative by region, age, gender, socioeconomic grade and ethnicity. And this is important because we lost some people from the original sample who didn't provide their postcode. So we needed to weight that data to ensure that it was representative of the overall population. Before I begin on the main findings, I think it's important to understand a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about deprivation in the context of this research. So, as I said, we use the Office for National Statistics Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is the official measure of relative deprivation for areas in England. And the index ranks 32,844 neighbourhoods according to their relative level of deprivation as defined by 7 areas. So income, employment, education, skills and training, health and disability, crime, barriers to housing and services, and the living environment. So it's this holistic picture of deprivation that we'll be drawing on in this research. And what we've done within this research as well is we've clustered neighbourhoods within a quintile, which is 20% of neighbourhoods, according to where the postcode sits within this index. So from quintile 1, the most deprived, to quintile 5, the least deprived. And so we've analysed the survey responses using these groupings. So when we talk about the most deprived, respondents from the most deprived areas, they're from those most deprived 20% of neighbourhoods. And the comparisons that we draw are primarily between the most deprived and the least deprived, so quintile 1 and quintile 5. So before I go on to talk about the volunteer experience, which is really kind of the core part of the time well spent data, I'll talk a little bit about the context that surrounds that kind of volunteering experience. So I think first thing to note is that volunteers from the most deprived areas have quite a different profile compared to the least deprived. They're more likely to be from the global majority, be disabled, younger, so aged 18 to 34, have children under the age of 18, be unemployed, and live in an urban area. And this is true for respondents overall, so it's not specific to volunteers, but it is crucial to kind of remember this demographic context and the wider findings, as the intersection of these identities will likely have an influence on some of the other findings that we're going to talk about. So if we look at the roles volunteers take in their organisations, we can see that volunteers from the most deprived areas are less likely to hold leadership roles, such as represent the organisation at meetings or events, and leading the group or being a trustee, than those from the least deprived areas. Perhaps unsurprisingly, alongside this, they're also less likely to feel they are given the opportunity to influence the development of the group. Instead, when volunteering, people from the most deprived areas are more likely than those from the least to take on practical roles, such as doing routine household jobs, decorating or doing home repairs, or car repairs, or filling in forms on behalf of someone else. So if we move on now to the volunteer experience, the first thing to note is that satisfaction with their volunteering experience is lower in the most deprived areas compared to the least. And the difference is biggest for those who say they are very satisfied. So that's 42% of volunteers from the most deprived areas compared to 60% from the least deprived areas. Some of the detail on the volunteer experience offers a bit of insight into what potentially lies behind the lower satisfaction among volunteers from the most deprived areas. So here we can see in deprived areas, volunteers are more likely to feel pressure from the organisation than those from the least deprived. So they're more likely to agree that their volunteering is becoming too much like paid work, that the organisation has unreasonable expectations, and that they feel pressured to do more than they would like to. Alongside the pressure to do more, those in the most deprived areas are feeling less recognised for their help than those in the least deprived areas. And they're also 5 times more likely to report negative effects on their health and well-being from volunteering than those in the least deprived areas. And then looking at the volunteer experience of the organisations themselves, we can see a bit more frustration with organisational structures and processes in the most deprived areas compared to the least. So this begins with onboarding on the left of the slide. Volunteers from the most deprived areas are more likely to have expected the process of getting involved to be quicker and less likely to agree that it was easy and straightforward than those from the least deprived areas. And then when they're involved with the organisation, they are more likely to feel there is too much bureaucracy and less likely to feel the group is flexible around the time that they give. Another element of the volunteer experience that this data presents is around the support structures and sense of belonging. So in terms of support structures, we can see the volunteers from the most deprived areas are less likely to feel well supported, less likely to feel they know how to raise an issue, and more likely to feel unsafe than those from the least deprived areas. And then in terms of belonging, they're less likely to feel they belong to the group, and more than 5 times more likely to feel excluded than those from the least deprived areas. So the final thing that I'll point to in this kind of section on the volunteer experience is we can see there is a disparity in the use of skills when volunteering. So those in the most deprived areas are less likely to have used their professional or other skills than those in the least deprived areas. And alongside this, those in the most deprived areas are more likely to have skills they did not use but would have liked to, and twice as likely to want more training, which suggests that volunteers in deprived areas want a bit more opportunity for using skills and for personal development through their volunteering than they're currently receiving. So perhaps an unmet opportunity here. So if we move on now to look at volunteer retention. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given what we've just heard, volunteers from the most deprived areas are less likely to continue volunteering than those from the least deprived areas. And the difference was getting biggest with those who were very likely to continue. So that's 37% of those in the most deprived areas compared to 58% in the least deprived areas. And when we look at the reasons given for not continuing, the most and the least deprived areas both most frequently point to changing circumstances as the reason for not continuing, but some notable differences do emerge. So volunteers from the most deprived areas are more likely than those from the least to not continue because of health conditions unrelated to COVID, or because they're unhappy with the way their volunteering is managed. So finally, if we take a look at barriers and enablers to volunteering, here we're going to be focusing primarily on non-volunteers. So that's people who haven't volunteered recently or have never volunteered. The first thing is that we can see the relative scale of the challenge of engaging people from deprived areas. So as the data on this slide shows, non-volunteers from the most deprived areas are more likely than those from the least deprived areas to say nothing would encourage them to volunteer, and they're not interested in any volunteering opportunities. So what barriers to volunteering exist? Well, in both the most and least deprived areas, not wanting to make an ongoing commitment and doing other things with their spare time are most commonly cited barriers to volunteering. Unsurprisingly though, perhaps the financial impact of volunteering is a bigger barrier in the most deprived areas, where non-volunteers are more likely than those from the least deprived areas to be concerned about ending up out of pocket through volunteering. And this is a fear which is actually validated to a certain extent by volunteers. So volunteers from the most deprived areas are more likely than those from the least deprived to disagree that their group would reimburse them for any expenses. Health and caring barriers are also more common in the most deprived areas than in the least. So this acts as a barrier to non-volunteers from deprived areas who are more likely than those from the least to point to caring commitments or to illness or disability as a barrier to volunteering. And actually, we can also see health needs acting as a barrier to those who've explored volunteering opportunities, with people from the most deprived areas 6 times more likely than those from the least deprived areas to say they didn't go on to take up an opportunity because it didn't accommodate their health needs. So if we finally kind of take a look at enablers to volunteering, what would encourage people, then flexibility is what stands out. So the most common factors that would encourage non-volunteers from deprived areas to volunteer were flexibility about the way they give. So for example, if they could do it from home, and if they could be flexible with the time they commit. So if we turn now to the conclusions, some of the conclusions we can draw from this data. Here I want to kind of present some reflections on what I feel really sort of stands out from this data. And I think the first thing is the barriers to volunteering that people from deprived areas face. So we've seen that barriers to volunteering related to financial cost are a real concern for the most deprived. It's perhaps not the most surprising finding, but it's important to have it confirmed in the data. But something that's emerged from this research alongside perhaps the more obvious financial barriers are the additional barriers people from deprived areas face. So it's the health conditions, disability and caring barriers, which are all more common than in the least deprived areas. I think all of this outlines the challenge of encouraging non-volunteers and retaining volunteers in these areas where multiple barriers to volunteering exist. And the second point to note is about the different relationship people from deprived areas appear to have with the organisations they volunteer with. So we've seen they're less likely than those in the least deprived areas to hold leadership positions or feel able to influence the development of the organisation. And overall, they feel less satisfied and pressured to do more. So I appreciate that it's not been a particularly optimistic picture so far. So the final reflection I'll offer up here is perhaps a little bit of an opportunity. So we saw that people from the most deprived areas are looking for more opportunities to use their skills and to develop during their volunteering, which is not currently being met. So perhaps there's potential here to address an unmet need and enhance that volunteering experience in these areas. I think these points highlight the challenges faced, but also the potential addressing some of these barriers to improve engagement and volunteer experiences in the most deprived areas. So on that note, I'll pass you on now to Catherine to talk you through some of the considerations for policy and practice.
Hi everyone, thanks so much Henry. So my name is Catherine Goodall and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Policy and Influencing Manager at NCVO and I lead on our volunteering policy work. And so we'll take a look at some of the considerations for practice and policy following on from what we've just heard from Henry. So I just wanted to start in terms of situating this research in the context and the context that we all know we're experiencing at the moment. So when we're looking at the policy and the practice implications, I think it's really important that we're considering the context we're all working in at the moment. So we know the cost of living crisis is continuing to have a significant impact. We're seeing widening and deepening poverty and deprivation, which are both really problematic. We're seeing rising demand for voluntary organisations at a time when also we're seeing falling rates of formal volunteering and challenges for recruitment and retention. So they're not universal. Lots of organisations are doing fine with their recruitment and retention, but overall we see that kind of falling formal rate. And we know that it's a general election year, which means it's more difficult in many ways around kind of policy work, and organisations and government might be considering other things. So overall, this kind of context, I think, is really important when we're thinking about these considerations. So we wanted to touch first on kind of considerations for practice, and I wanted to bring up sort of 4 areas, so access, development, costs and awareness. So we'll start with the first 2. So in terms of thinking about access, at the moment we're not presenting sort of all the solutions to this, especially because your context and your volunteers and your activities are so varied and so diverse. So instead we wanted to pose some questions to really prompt some reflection. So in terms of access, can your roles be adapted to ensure they're more accessible for people with health issues, for disabled people, for people with caring responsibilities? Can people with lived experience be included in the development of opportunities? So not just kind of at the end of the process, but at the beginning, how can people with lived experience of what you're working on be really meaningfully involved in the design of activities and roles? In terms of development, how can we develop our volunteers? Are there training and development opportunities that could be built into the volunteering process? And obviously with that, we would caution that organisations need to be taking a balanced approach, so not providing too much of a benefit for volunteers that sits outside of their role, but really meaningfully thinking about how you can support and develop the volunteers you're engaging. And as we sort of saw, lots of volunteers are saying that they're not getting a chance to use the skills that they already have or to develop some skills that they wanted to. So really thinking about that in the kind of design of roles and activities. And then if we're thinking about costs and awareness, so costs are obviously such a huge barrier and such a huge challenge for so many people, particularly in deprived areas and people living in poverty. So we're really recommending that reimbursement should be as fast and as straightforward and accessible as possible. So we know for lots of organisations, people may not have traditionally asked for reimbursement for their expenses or not known how to. And I think it's really important that organisations are thinking about that from the outset. What would make it easiest? What would be the easiest, quickest and most straightforward way of providing reimbursement for activities? And then thinking about that, how can we reduce stigma around claiming expenses? So particularly if you've got other volunteers who aren't claiming expenses, what are the ways we can make it easier to make sure people can be reimbursed for their activities? And in terms of awareness, how can your offer be showcased to people living in deprived areas? How are volunteers aware of the support and opportunities that you offer? And how can that be communicated better? So in terms of awareness, I would flag that our colleagues at NCVO do run training around recruitment of volunteers, and lots of that focuses on how you can kind of engage other people or build your kind of engagement activities more broadly. So I'd really recommend that as a plug for colleagues' work there. So if we move on and we consider what the volunteering policy context looks like. So volunteering is a devolved matter. We talk about this quite a lot. So that means across the UK, volunteering is devolved to each of the UK nations. And there's not currently a single strategy for volunteering in England. So the Civil Society strategy in 2018 is the most recent overarching strategy. And that was partly one of the factors that brought us together as a sector to develop the vision for volunteering that many of you will be really familiar with. So us as a sector understanding what we can do better around supporting volunteers and reducing barriers, and also creating the change we want to see in volunteering. So, but this isn't to say that government aren't interested in volunteering, they really are, and we've seen lots of engagement over recent years, including the Tackling Loneliness strategy, which has a big focus on volunteering, as we know that that's really important for people building up social connections and reducing loneliness. And also there's a lot of funding being provided through the Know Your Neighbourhood Fund, working deprived areas to improve volunteering. And also the Department for Culture, Media and Sport is also a key partner in the vision for volunteering, as well as providing funding for Big Help Out and other activities. So that's sort of setting out what the policy context looks like in England. So when we think about some of the key considerations for policy, again, this is giving us really unique insight and evidence, this research, and it's a starting point really for us to explore that further. So we know that poverty and deprivation are hugely complex issues, and therefore any of the solutions that might be out there to address them are many and varied. And we know that there'll also be implications both for policy specifically focused on volunteering and making it easier to volunteer, but also on policy focused on poverty and deprivation. So what does the impact of that policy making have on volunteering, and how can volunteers actually be useful in achieving policy goals? So if we think about it, the government has a range of goals that rely on volunteering, including addressing local inequality. So we've seen it through the Levelling Up agenda is a recent way of attempting to address some of that inequality. But volunteers will be an essential part of government's goals in terms of economic growth, in terms of supporting communities to be strong and resilient. But we know that there's more that we could do to coordinate policy making on volunteering, and policy interventions, this is really important, can really be effective in addressing poverty, which I think is really, when we're talking about these difficult, complex and ingrained challenges, we also know that there's evidence that policy can actually make a real difference, which I think should give us some hope when we're thinking about this. So we've got a couple of considerations. So we really want policymakers to think about better understanding barriers to volunteering in deprived areas and working with the sector to co-create policy solutions, which we're seeing through the Know Your Neighbourhood Fund and other kind of activities, and we really encourage that. We're really looking at how we can consider what levers are out there already that could create change. So people might already be aware that NCVO and others are campaigning to to review the mileage allowance payment, so that 45p a mile rate for paid staff that volunteers also often use, and supporting things like the Essentials Guarantee, calling to make sure that people in poverty and deprived areas have the basics that they need to live a happy, healthy life. And we really want to explore how policy changes could support volunteering to achieve government's goals as well. So like we mentioned, it's not just about policy relating to volunteering, but also how volunteers are an important part of the policy making sphere. So I think we've also got some considerations here for sort of private and public sector. So we know that there are huge opportunities across this to better support and encourage staff to volunteer. So lots of organisations provide paid time off to volunteer. NCVO does. I was volunteering yesterday, actually. It's a huge privilege, I think. But we know that that take-up rate of employer-supported volunteering is often quite low. So what could organisations do differently to better support that? We're also interested in how the private sector can engage and support the voluntary sector, particularly looking at addressing inequalities. So that could be kind of partnering with local volunteering infrastructure. Sorry, there's a bit of noise in the background. Exploring how we could better support volunteering activities in different ways. We also want to explore how the public sector can best support volunteering and make sure that volunteer roles are accessible and enjoyable, as we know that sometimes volunteers in public sector roles report that they have a less positive experience. So that's a quick overview of some of the reflections that we have, and I will hand back over to Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Henry and Catherine. That was also perfect timing. So now we have some time for some guest reflections. We're really lucky to have Sian Mollart with us from VAST to talk through kind of their reflections on this research. Unfortunately, one of our speakers is unwell today, but luckily my colleague Catherine is happy to run through some of their slides and sort of information. Remember, if you do have any questions, use the Q&A function and we'll come back to those questions later. And I think I'll pass over to Sian now.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I'll just let Henry stop sharing. So I don't know if you can overtake when you share. There we go. Share. Has that worked for everyone? Yeah, thank you. So I'm Sian Mollart. I'm a project officer at VAST. And I'm here today just to talk about that kind of our approach to volunteering in Stoke-on-Trent, and how we've kind of used the Time Well Spent report and our own research to improve our offer around volunteering. So VAST, we've been going since 1920, and essentially we're a one-stop shop for the VCSE sector. So we offer lots of kind of different levels of support, and we follow the framework of the 4 functions of infrastructure, which was co-produced by NAVGA and its members. And those 4 functions are leadership and advocacy, partnerships and collaboration, capacity building, and my favourite, not that I'm biased in any way, is the volunteering. And we do this through kind of a range of our different projects and support offer. So all the things on the screen are different things that we do. So we have our FAB support team that will work directly with organisations. But the bit we're mainly here to talk to you today is our volunteering services. So on our website is how it looks for volunteers when they come and have a look. So anything orange is volunteering, so we're nice and obvious when people try and find information. And we kind of work 2-sided around volunteering. So we work directly with volunteers as well as organisations. So our approach to volunteering is kind of broken down into lots of different areas. So we have our brokerage service, so supporting organisations to find the volunteers they need and the volunteers to find the role that's right for them. We have our inclusive volunteering project, which I'll talk a little bit more later on. So that fits in really nicely with some of the key themes that have come out from the Time Well Spent report. We have our volunteer managers network, our training, It's funny that Catherine mentioned around employee supported volunteering, because we have been increasing our offer around CSR and ESG, and we also have a quality standard scheme as well for organisations. So the reason why we thought that Stoke was really relevant for this is that Stoke in the Midlands is a quite deprived area. So I've got some statistics from the English Indices of Deprivation in 2019, and Stoke-on-Trent now has the 12th highest proportion of deprived neighbourhoods out of the 317 council districts. So we are up there, and 51 of our cities, 159 localities, are amongst the most 10% deprived nationally. And you can see that's going up since they last did them in 2015. So that breaks down that almost a third of Stoke-on-Trent neighbourhoods are amongst the worst in the country for deprivation. There definitely are areas of Stoke-on-Trent that are more affluent. So we do have kind of the more affluent and least deprived volunteers coming to us, as well as the most deprived volunteers. So it is really interesting for us as a volunteer centre to work with kind of the full spectrum of people. So these statistics are quite doomy gloomy, but it's definitely not that way where volunteering is concerned. So it is absolutely massive within Stoke-on-Trent. So these are statistics taken from our service that over 870 volunteers have been placed through our service since COVID. And this for us, it's we know the fact that they've started and they've enjoyed the role. It's not just that we've gone, oh, this is a good organisation for you to go to. We know that these volunteers have been placed there. It is our goal to hit 1,000 this year, which we definitely think we'll manage. We've advertised over 500 different roles, and we've currently got 250 live on our website. And the sort of scale of roles we've got is huge. It's not just your stereotypical charity shops and food banks, and I think that's why our service is so successful, because volunteers can really find something that they want. So they might want to be they might want to volunteer in a cafe, so we've got community cafes, we've got community luncheons they can go volunteer at. They might want to be a befriender, they might want to volunteer within admin. We've got a really, really good range of opportunities available. So our volunteer brokerage service, we make sure it's as accessible as possible. So we accept volunteers in any which way, any format, we'll have them anyway. So volunteers can pop in and visit our centre. They can phone, they can send an email, or they can register online with a really, really short form. We also accept referrals from a wide range of professionals, and that list is growing week by week. So we get a lot of referrals from social prescribers, mental health workers, rehabilitation workers, probation officers, work coaches, lots and lots of different professionals that refer into us now. And what we think is quite unique with our service is that we treat each new potential volunteer as an individual, and we tailor our approach to them. So some people we will just chat to over email. They don't need a lot of help. They just need pointing in the right direction. Some people chat to over the phone, but the majority are in-person kind of in-depth appointments where we'll sit down over a nice cup of tea and really chat to them about what they want and what they're looking for. And we follow them through their whole kind of volunteer journey. So once we've done that referral for an ideal organisation, we don't close the door and say goodbye. We follow them through and make sure that when they are placed, they're enjoying it and they're happy. If they've got any concerns, we can help to address those. So we really stay with those volunteers, which is really nice. So we were able to do some research for quite a hyperlocal piece for Stoke-on-Trent and North Staffordshire across 6 weeks in February and March 2023. And this was all around kind of people's perceptions to volunteering and what barriers there might be. So we were able to engage with over 150 individuals. For those who maybe weren't confident to, or they're excluded from volunteering, as well as those who've overcome barriers to engage with volunteering. So we asked several questions, but two of the ones I'm going to highlight is, why do people volunteer? So a lot of people volunteering for personal reasons, which could break down to kind of social benefits, as well as helping with routine, purpose, benefit their mental health. But also there was more interest-based volunteering, as well as support towards seeking employment, so looking to fill in a gap on their CV, which is really important in more deprived areas like Stoke-on-Trent, where people might be struggling to find work for relevant experience. Volunteering can be a great sort of step up for that. We wanted to make the research visual, so we created some word clouds, which for us is a great reminder about why people want to volunteer. So you can see that the largest one on there is helping others gain a sense of gratitude, spread positivity. And for us, this is just a really great way to make sure we're understanding people's motivations. As if you understand your motivations, you're more likely to be able to retain the volunteers and ensure that they have a good experience as well. We didn't just focus on sort of the positive things with volunteering, we also focused on the barriers to volunteering. So no surprise to probably anyone on this Zoom that mental health was a big barrier, as well as confidence. But also what surprised us was around the perceived stigma of being a volunteer, but also not being wanted or being helpful, so then being more of a hindrance. So for us, that gives us really good ideas. Actually, we need to make sure that we will explain to volunteers that you're there to learn if you need to, and that's okay. There was also big concerns around flexibility, which has come up in the time well spent report as well, and transport issues, which again has come up on the time well spent report. So for us, it's great that the national research is also matching what we're finding locally. So a couple of links to the time well spent report, that it said that people are quite frustrated with organisational processes. That is definitely something that we found, that organisations have quite long and tedious sort of onboarding processes. So within our volunteer brokerage, we can manage people's expectations. So we can say, oh, if you're looking for something with a really quick turnaround, these are your best options. Whereas if you're kind of not in a rush to get started straight away, this is maybe a more suitable option for you. The report also found that volunteers in the most deprived areas think that volunteering is becoming more like paid work and they're feeling too much pressure. Again, that's something that we really agree with, that flexibility was a massive concern and a barrier, and people felt quite forced to do it. And obviously that is not volunteering at the end of the day when they're forced to do it. So what we're doing with our organisations is that we're working with them to help them prioritise flexibility. So it still works for the organisation, but it might make their roles more attractive to a wider range of volunteers. And we're doing this a lot through kind of right from the beginning with their role descriptions. And already this is having benefits to their kind of volunteer numbers. One of the things that really stuck out to us within the report is that volunteers from most deprived areas are less likely to hold leadership roles. And that's something at VAST that we feel quite passionate about changing. So with our training and networking events, we make sure that they're open to anyone in an organisation, which gives volunteers the opportunity to get more involved and get their voices heard. And we've been encouraging organisations to maybe start their own volunteering networks, where volunteers can have power in decision making. So for us, we were really glad when the vision for volunteering came out and has a whole theme around power, because that kind of gives us some national backup that it's not just us saying it, it's happening across England. Within the report, it also mentions around volunteers with disabilities, and that they're less likely to be positive around the way their volunteering was organised. This is something that we've actually found a different story with, in that locally people were mainly complimentary of how they've been included in their organisation. And we think that's because we were able to offer really personalised brokerage service, and that we could have those more awkward conversations first. So a volunteer isn't getting their hopes up and crushed because somewhere isn't accessible, or they're not able to include this, or they're not able to tweak that. We can do that for the volunteer. So we're keeping their motivation nice and high, because we're saying we'll take that kind of difficult conversation away from them that they have to have in every other element of their lives. Why don't we make it a bit easy with their volunteering? Which leads us really nicely onto our couple of projects that have been really helping us around inclusive volunteering. So following from the research, we launched this project, which has been going since June 2023, and we've engaged with 111 volunteers. And this is in addition to maintaining our kind of core brokerage. And this project is for anyone with a barrier stopping them from engaging in volunteering. And we're really flexible on what we define by a barrier. So it's anyone who can't just walk into a role and get started. So within this, we have introduced an introduction to volunteering training scheme. So if anyone's considering volunteering or they've started and they're not quite sure what's expected of them, we can just kind of give them a little quick introduction session. We can offer a much slower pace for helping them get matched to a role. So if that takes 3 or 4 appointments with them sat in our cafe, we will do 3 or 4 appointments with them to find that role. And it normally means that the role is a much better fit, and the volunteer is more likely to stay and be included. As we know that confidence and mental health is a big barrier with volunteering, we've also introduced Wellbeing Wednesdays and a lot of things around confidence and mindfulness to encourage volunteers. This is one of our amazing volunteers, Gary, who came through our inclusive volunteering service. He has suffered with his mental health his entire life pretty much, and has really struggled to find something for him. But you can see kind of the quotes on the screen that he feels like the person he was 45 years ago, and moving forwards, he's now actually considering employment again, which when he first met Gary, that was never ever kind of something on the table to him. So it's amazing that kind of through a little bit of extra help, he's been able to find an amazing role. Another sort of group that are a massive, that are more likely to be in deprived areas or living in poverty is asylum seekers and refugees. And Stoke-on-Trent has quite a high population of asylum seekers and refugees living in the area. So we were able to secure funding for a second project specifically around helping asylum seekers and refugees get into volunteering. And since September 2023, we've engaged with 91 people, and that number goes up on the weekly, which is really fantastic. So we've been working with organisations to help them create more inclusive roles that can support an asylum seeker or refugee. And we know that not everyone is ready to volunteer straight away. So with this project, we've had some micro volunteer events, which is a great kind of stepping stone for them to consider, oh, actually, I have got a lot I can give back to my community. And there's a lot of other benefits. So it can help them improve their English. It can help them feel more connected to their communities when they've got such a sense of loss in other areas of their life. So you can see the lovely group of asylum seekers and refugees we had volunteering with us. And a lot of them made appointments that same day to discuss further volunteering, which was amazing to see. We have another one of these planned this time next week. This time next week, we will be making bird feeders and volunteering with Staff to Wildlife Trust with 20 asylum seekers and refugees. So the micro volunteering is a great way for them to almost trial run volunteering and help them realise that they are so capable. In order for volunteering to work for other people with deprived areas, we know that there's a lot of support that we need to give our organisations. So I'm going to stop tour through some of this support that we offer to them. So we've created a series of guides with more plans. So working with young volunteers, again, in the Time Well Spent report, it mentions that volunteers from deprived areas tend to be younger. So we were able to put a guide together with things that organisations need to consider when working with young volunteers. We've also created a guide kind of around inclusive volunteering. And that really is just kind of a nice little friendly reminder of where organisations can turn to if they need a quick bit of advice. So they've been really successful. We run a volunteer managers network, which is a great space to share best practice, share ideas, provide mutual support, and for people really to bounce ideas off. And that's really great. We've got around 80 members of that, which is fantastic. Another thing that we launched as a result of the inclusive volunteering is a volunteers forum. And this idea actually came around when we ran a vision volunteer and ripple effect session in Stoke-on-Trent. The volunteers were like, we don't have anything that we can feed our voices back to. So we launched a volunteers forum. The photos on the screen are from our most recent one, which had a mindfulness theme to it again to try and continue on those kind of Wellbeing Wednesdays. And we've got our next one planned for Volunteers Week, which would be really lovely. And again, that's giving those volunteers a chance to be decision makers and feedback their thoughts and opinions. We provide the one-to-one support for organisations. So quite often myself and my colleague Gloria will get a phone call from an organisation saying they've got a volunteer who might have autism, for example. What things could they put in place if they get overstimulated or they get overwhelmed? And we can offer advice around that. So yeah, we get lots of phone calls or emails asking for little bits of advice, but also we can offer more in-depth support for organisations who are either right at the start of involving volunteers journey or maybe have been offering volunteer placements for a long time. We work with lots of different organisations on that. We offer training for volunteer managers. So there's 2 different levels to this. So we have an introduction to volunteer management, which is just a half-day course. It gives them a really kind of solid building block foundation for working with volunteers. And then we were fed back that organisations would like a more in-depth one. So we created a full-depth course, which includes kind of the whole volunteer journey, overcoming barriers, EDI, conflict resolution and problem solving. And again, we get lots of people coming onto that. We sometimes get volunteers who want to go into coordinating other volunteers in their organisation. So it's really great when we see people sort of come back through that full circle. And then the last thing I want to talk about is our quality standards. And this was developed as a result of our volunteer managers network, that a lot of the grassroots organisations felt that they couldn't go for some of the national schemes due to the cost involved with them. So we developed our own local version, which is completely free for organisations to access. There's 3 different levels, and it really, really champions that kind of best volunteer practice. We've had lots of organisations go through it. In fact, I had another organisation land in my inbox this morning who sent me all their evidence, so I'm really looking forward to reading that. And you can see the quote for below. That's a really grassroots organisation, and for them it really helped them overhaul their kind of whole volunteering offer, cross all the T's, dot all their I's, so they feel a lot more confident in managing their volunteers, and they've been able to create a lot more volunteer roles since doing the scheme. So that is me done. I apologise that I've gone over a little bit, but hopefully that was useful. But feel free to contact me on the email address, or you can visit our website and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sian. That was brilliant. We'll now go to Catherine quickly for a few reflections from groundwork. And then I think we'll probably just have 5 minutes to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. I'll hand over to you now, Catherine.
Hi everyone, can you? Yeah, you can hear me. Brilliant. So thank you so much for that, Sian. It's really helpful. So unfortunately, our colleague Ella Cardinale at Groundwork is unwell and isn't able to join us, but thankfully she has shared some slides, and I think they're really interesting. So Groundwork is a national organisation, but they're also running the Green Patch, which is a community garden in Kettering. And so Groundwork is a large organisation, like I mentioned. It's an environmental charity that has a few different main aims. And within that, in Northamptonshire, they're running the Green Patch, which is a green space near a deprived estate in Kettering. And within that, they run a volunteer involving programme that as part of a community gardening programme that has about 40 to 100 volunteers. And I talked really compellingly about how all these volunteers are involved and the exciting things that they're doing. And they work with a bunch of adults with experiencing complex life challenges. So in all sorts of different ways that's sort of showing up, and they're supporting their volunteers in a caring environment. And so they see the Green Patch as a way to connect with people and find that gardening is a really powerful tool that helps people create a sense of calm and forge new relationships. And they find that really being outside is really helpful for people's well-being. And it's part of their process of building up a sense of trust and relationships with people in the local area. They've got some wonderful pictures of some of their volunteers growing plants and having a lovely time outside, which I think is just, I thought was really inspiring and really lovely, particularly in the sunshine. I don't know if it's quite grey where I am today. But they run a bunch of different services. So they have community gardening activities, meditations, health walks, lunches, and lots of different ways for their volunteers to get involved. So they talked really compellingly about how they've got such a broad mix of their volunteers, and they've experimented with lots of different ways of supporting their volunteers, and find that mixed groups with their range of volunteers is really working really well. So actually having that kind of range of age and gender and nationality is really useful, and the volunteers really appreciate it. And they're often finding that the volunteers who are coming to them have a lot of multifaceted challenges and often kind of need support from at least a couple of different local services, but often don't have the connections to those services already. So they find that through this volunteer programme, they can often act as a bit of a directory or a broker for those kind of support services. And then they also receive referrals from local charities as well. So people will refer into their volunteering programme. And so they talked about having a physical site, and that really helps people understand what's going on. So the volunteers will come to them because they're on the edge of this estate. People will come as a kind of sort of social triage, they sort of call it. So they might not go to an official service for some support, but they would come to the garden and get stuck in and get involved. And then that can be a way of helping them to make connections with other services and to build up trust, because they're just there as part of the community. So they talked about really placing an emphasis on a people-led and person-centered support. So they have a lot of consultations and forums, and they're often checking in with the local community and building a lived experience, not just creating sort of services or projects on assumptions, but really making sure that they work for the volunteers. And they talked really compellingly as well about their volunteers getting involved in growing the vegetables, but then also being able to benefit through a community cafe in a way that would be less stigmatizing perhaps than using other types of food banks. Their volunteers have said. So that for me is a quick run through, and I will stop sharing my slides. So as I said, Ella was unfortunately not able to join us today, but has shared their email address, and I can share it in the chat as well.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So I think now we just have 5 minutes to pick up some of the questions that have been sent through. I don't think we'll be able to necessarily get through all of them, but really useful for us to see what you're most interested in and where there might be sort of knowledge gaps for all of us. I wonder if first we could kind of go to this question about skills and any insight about the types of skills that people want to use but aren't using. Sian, I don't know if you have any reflections from your work.
Sorry, my internet dropped out then a second, so I just got, have you got any reflection? And I was like, oh, about what? Sorry.
So there's a question in about skills and what are the types of skills that people want to use but aren't using. This might be something that you've come across in your work, but it also might just be an evidence gap that we need to go and explore.
Yeah, I think a lot of the skills that people want to use is a lot of people want to use skills they've gained from their personal experience, if that makes sense. So it might be that maybe they've gone through kind of mental health services and they want to use their personal experience of that to give back to others, but because of other barriers, they're not able to contribute that in a meaningful role. So sometimes people get, they feel concerned about, oh, well, it might trigger them because they've gone through it themselves, but actually it could be a real strength for the organisation to hear from someone who's gone through the same circumstances and come out the other side as what their clients are going through. So sometimes we have to do a lot around kind of don't be scared to take risks with a volunteer and actually allowing them to make their own decisions for those kind of things. I'm trying to think of something. We get a lot of people who want to use skills around kind of finance. Maybe they've got experience with that, but people get quite touchy about money and finance, rightly so. So it's around, okay, what roles could you introduce as kind of like a pilot for that? And again, just kind of that ripple out effect of start really small with them and then you could build on it.
Thank you so much, Sian. There's also another question about why is there more frustration in deprived areas for people who are kind of volunteering? I'm wondering if this is sort of partly about kind of lack of resource for organisations in some of these areas, might also be experiencing kind of higher demand for support. But I don't know if kind of any others on the panel have any reflections.
I guess that's it's such a good question as well, because I think it'd be really interesting to understand more about some of the causal links between these findings, and I think that's something we could explore in more detail, because we know that there's often, but not always, a correlation between a kind of lack of infrastructure of different forms in different areas, particularly in deprived areas, and and colleagues on the call probably have a very strong experience of this locally, but there's often lots of other reasons as well. So if people are kind of really struggling in their day-to-day lives, they might just have a less positive experience of their volunteering when they're sort of fitting it in. I think there's lots and lots of reasons that are probably impacting on people's experiences. I think it's a good thing for us to kind of explore in more detail and try and understand.
I think sometimes as well that there's lots of other parts of their life that can be difficult due to them living in deprivation. So they want their volunteering maybe to be the really nice, happy, positive thing in their life. So when there's barriers thrown up or complex processes that they might not necessarily understand, then it can really kind of demoralize them, because they're like, oh, well, this is the fun part of my life where I get to give back and you're making it hard for me. I think that sometimes it can just always sometimes be that final nail in the coffin when we've got this going on and that going on, and then that isn't easy for them when it should be, because they just want to volunteer and help other people.
I would say from a research perspective, I think something that kind of struck me when doing this research is that there is some information out there, but there's not the whole picture in terms of the way volunteering and deprivation relate to each other. And I think, you know, we've offered a bit of an insight here into some of that, but I think as Catherine says, some of those causal links and that kind of more deeper understanding is maybe an area for further exploration, and something that, you know, further research going forward would be great to see in this area.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm really conscious that we're slightly behind on time. There are some more kind of questions to be answered around DBS checks and support for refugees. But I wonder if these are things that we can sort of pick up and kind of follow up in an email later. I think now if we go to our break, thank you so much for your reflection, Sian, and also Catherine and Henry. And when we come back from the break, you'll be put into groups for your discussions. And if we aim to come back at 11:10, that would be great. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you all had a good discussion. We are running slightly behind on time, but I think we have still have a bit of time for Catherine to run through her session to help to inform our next steps. Catherine, shall I pass to you to share your slides?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody. Let me just bring up my screen for you all. So yeah, we have a bit of an interactive session. We can whiz through this a little bit, but we wanted to think about, now that we've sort of found this really interesting information from our research, what can we do next and what do we want to see? We will see if my slides will actually move forward. So yes, we've got an interactive session for you. So we want to hear from you. We've got sort of 3 main questions to explore, and we'll be doing that using Mentimeter, which is a nice and exciting tool, which helps us all kind of share some views and share our responses. So we kind of want to explore 3 different questions with you. Sorry, now I'm flitting between my screens. This is flawless use of technology always. So the first sort of question, so this will come up as a word cloud, so you can write anything you like in this response to this question, but we wanted to give some options in case there were specific things that you were interested in. So we do have some options here. So what would you most want to see change in volunteering in deprived areas? So there are options including, sorry, bear with me, options on the screen, and I will start the Mentimeter now if I can. That's the wrong slide, so sorry, bear with me. So yeah, we can see them coming up on this. Flawless. So yes, as you can see, lots of different options are coming up here. So what do you most want to see change to support volunteering in deprived areas? So more funding to support, more funding, resources, some more infrastructure. Tackling digital exclusion. I think lots of you have talked about that today. If anyone is struggling, so Chanel has put the code and the website in the chat. You can just click on the link and add your thoughts. Yeah, more training. Yeah, expenses, flexible roles. And like I said, because we're still exploring what we will do next and what we'll understand, it's so helpful to get your feedback and your input at this point, and to understand what you think is important or what you would want to see change. There's lots coming up here about mental health. I think that's something that comes out a lot, doesn't it, in deprived areas and for people in poverty. Grassroots centred, I think that's really important as well, isn't it? Understanding what volunteers want and what they need, making sure there's opportunities for them to shape their experiences. Increasing mileage allowance, tackling stigma. I think that's so important. It's funny when it jumps around, isn't it? Well, the language used, that's an important one as well. Thinking about what language we're using when we're creating our volunteer roles, when we're engaging different volunteers, when we're promoting them. We talked in our sort of breakout space a bit about how we're sharing opportunities and exploring them. Confidence building, yeah, lots of people talked about kind of volunteers in their areas needing a bit more support or a bit more kind of engagement to get going, or to take on more of those leadership roles that we saw. Thanks so much. We're kind of got a lot of responses here, which is really helpful. And then so I think we'll probably move on to the next slide now. I think you still have access to the Menti after this point, and it will still be open for a couple of days. So if you think about things, you can continue to add them, and we will have the information. But we've also got this second question, which I think should also be open to you now. So this is one where you can rate whether you agree or disagree what you might want NCVO to do to support volunteering in deprived areas. So there's definitely a caveat here that we might not be able to do any or all of these things, but this is more just to find out from you what you're interested in, what you might want to see NCVO do, if you might want to, if you think there are particular things that NCVO should be doing. And we can see as people respond, the numbers on these different options will sort of change. So we'll see kind of different responses come in. And it's about sort of how much you kind of agree or disagree that you'd like to see NCVO do different aspects. So like I said, we can't necessarily do everything here, but I think it's really helpful for us to know what you see as NCVO's potential role in this space. And you can also see the shape of these different, curves. You can see where people have given different responses, which is also really helpful for us to be able to see whether you all agree, whether there's a spread of kind of agreement on different options. I think it's interesting seeing the shape of these different curves as well. It's always interesting to see whether people want more of a particular thing. I'm not sure. Yeah, we've had about 25, and it might take you a bit of time to think about these things of what you particularly want, or you might not want any of these things from NCVO, but we'll keep the slides open so you can take a bit of time to think about this if you'd like. And we do also have a final question for you. So I think we've got the word cloud, we've got options from NCVO, and then this was about kind of thinking about the broader environment of if there were any of these sort of changes that you might want to see that might make it easier for people to volunteer in deprived areas. Which of these would you think is most important? So would you want to see changes to the welfare state? Would you want to see funding for volunteering infrastructure? Oh, sorry, it says that options are off. I think that should allow people to respond. Would you like to see changes in the law to make it easier to volunteer? Would you like to see increases in the mileage allowance payment rate that both paid staff and volunteers use? Would you like to see, there was another one there. Oh yeah, funding directly for volunteer involving programs. So you might not particularly want to see any of these, and you're more than welcome to put comments in the chat as well if you want other things, or if you think of other things. But we really wanted to get a sense from you of which of these options you might think are most useful or most important. It's also interesting watching it swap as people give their responses as well. I think it's interesting seeing whether it's direct funding for volunteer infrastructure or volunteer involving programs themselves, or kind of other broader changes. So just give it another moment or two. And like I said, we'll keep the Menti open for you, so you've got a bit of time to think about these questions and to add your thoughts. If this is a bit of a quick end of the session, but we'll find this really helpful to reflect on, especially alongside all of the other elements that you've contributed today, and kind of combining all the responses to these different questions to understand what you'd most want to see next. Excellent. So I think at this point I might stop sharing the Menti. So I think you've all still got access to the Menti if you want to, and I can come back to the main slides if I can. Let's see. Bear with me. Right, what I might just do is stop sharing and come back to the actual slideshow itself. Flawless technical. There we go. we are back. So if I hand back over to Rebecca now, so thank you all for taking part in that.
Thanks so much, Catherine. If I could get the next slide, please. So before we wrap up, we'd really love your feedback about this session. So soon a snap poll will appear on your screen. It'd be great if you could quickly leave us some feedback here. And if you could spare a few minutes at the end, a feedback form will appear in your browser when you leave the event as well. We'd really love to know what you valued and also what you'd want us to improve on. Just give you all a little bit of time to fill this in. So if we could go to the next slide. So in terms of the next steps, the full report is out in May, so do keep an eye open for that. If you want to continue the discussion and the debate, please use the hashtag TimeWellSpent2023. We do also have some resources available, which we've detailed on the next slide. So here we've got links to the Vision for Volunteering, NCVO guidance, our Time Well Spent reports, as well as our training and consultancy offer. And we'll make sure that you have these slides as well, so you can look at all of these different links. And finally, just to say thank you so much for participating today, for asking such good questions and for sharing your ideas. Really helpful for us to know kind of your perspective. And of course, kind of any queries, please do email Henry about the research. Thanks so much.